Just two comments. Lest you think the folks in the Pentagon where I work weren't interested in encouraging more vigilance about nuclear weapons design activities. There were discussions, I don't know since when they have bothered to rejoin the issue, but quite a while ago when we were engaged in fighting Iraq, it was an issue. And some of the objections to encouraging the IEA to get into this were, as you mentioned, I think Fred Clay put it best, it's now a college for countries to learn how to defeat inspections, because they go and they learn how to do inspections. So, just like any good policeman can become a great criminal, you have a problem. And then he said it may become a graduate school for bomb design. So that little, snide comment. I think, that said, I sympathize with your point of view. This is something the agency clearly should be able to have certain capabilities and to do. However, there was another comment which I think will be more difficult to downplay, and that is something which is true as well in a much more fundamental way, and that is, if you're a modern country and you're working on things like anti-tank explosives and the such, you're doing an awful lot of work on shaped charges. And these are the things that are the explosives and the things that are complicated in an implosion design. They're not everything, but they're a big part of the complication of doing bomb design. And there are other things that go on having to do with hydrodynamic problems and other aspects of military development that, well, roughly can be useful also for hydrodynamic problem solving associated with weapons design. What I'm trying to get at is we should do all the things you mentioned, but we should not overrate how much of a wall that might be to the problem set. Finally, one other comment. One of the things that Greg's book sensitizes you to, well, actually two comments, is, first of all, does anybody know what the yield of that diagrammed nuclear warhead circa 2003 for Iran was supposed to be? Anybody know? Very important number. Maybe, yes. Yeah. Does anybody know? Because that number may be the only number you want to remember when you walk out of here. It was 10 kilotons. Now, why is that an interesting number? Well, if you read Greg's book, just the introduction, that's the Gentleman Cease chapter. If you only read one chapter, read that. You can get away with a little bit of murder. You won't have to read the rest of the book necessarily, but at least read that. You should, but at least read that one. In there is a discussion that the weapon that you can design using 1950s technology is approximately 12 kilotons. And it's roughly the diameter that would fit in that missile. Now, why would people settle for 70% of the lethal area of Hiroshima? Surely they'd want more. Well, the rejoinder is, just as bomb design has changed since 1945, the delivery system accuracies have vastly improved. India, China, North Korea, South Korea, Iran, all have what we thought in 1987 was the most advanced missile guidance technology in the world. You can go down to the Air and Space Museum a few blocks from here and look at it. It's Pershing II. It's called Maneuverable Reentry Vehicle. Well, they have it. That gives them accuracies of 500 yards or less. Now, if you know something about probability of kill calculations and accuracy, there isn't a target on the point of the Earth that's on the surface that cannot be destroyed with that kind of accuracy and that kind of yield. And if somebody thinks you can't make a political statement destroying a city center with 12 kilotons, I got a bridge I can sell you. That's enough. This is a different world. This is a different military calculation than anyone is thinking about. Welcome to your future. That problem set is not just from reactor grade, but things that could be made from reactors, including, if you empty the reactor early, weapons grade. So the problem, again, has to do with the spread of the plutonium production capacity. Now you'll say, well, but where will I get the reprocessing know-how? And the rejoinder is that is a chemical process, and much has been released publicly over the years to show that roughly you need a room maybe 3 times the size of this one, and that's it. And it will fit, and it won't throw off a signal till you're ready to go. You can build it in a matter of maybe as little as 6 months, and you run it for a week for your first bomb's worth, and 1 weapon a day afterwards. That is a problem. In fact, we've already had our first brush with that in 2012 when they unloaded Bouchier. There were not inspectors in the building. We freaked out and flew drones over it, about 12 or 13 of them, to make sure nothing left the building. Because there was about 10 to 20 bombs worth of weapons-grade plutonium in the spent fuel. So this is the new future. We're no longer talking about hypotheticals here. All right, let's open it up.
I'm going to start with questions, Greg, although I know your particular point on safeguards. Greg, I'm glad that you were able to make good use of the first plutonium in the first 50 years, and you originally contributed with the consulting work you did for us at DOE. As you may know, that book in 1996 arose originally from the work that was done outside the government on the special isotope separation, the laser isotope separation concerns about what is the inventory, and then eventually that led 7 years later to the plutonium in the first 50 years. And so, of course, that was, you mentioned the 62 details weren't released back in the 70s, but they were released, of course, in that, the appendix in the 96 plutonium in the first 50 years. So that is public now, some of the details in that. Of course, you mentioned the big issue is the burn-up time and the target, using fertile targets for distinguishing between reactors and weapons grade. The concern that we had originally was using laser isotope separation. So you could take any quality of plutonium, any mixture of the burn-up isotopes, and then selectively isolate the different isotopes using SIS. I wonder how much that remains as concern when you were at IAEA, Olli, that technology getting out there. So we're dependent on reprocessing, even as Henry says, a room not much bigger than we're in, but SIS would allow you, or Atlas or LAS would allow you to do even less, and then you use the plutonium we're creating right now from Calvert Cliffs.
Yeah, yes. Let's look, for the IAEA perspective. There are 2 aspects to this. The first aspect is that, are you able to find a clandestine processing facility? Or is this happening in the declared place or location or declared site? For the latter one, it's much more easier because IAEA has different tools. It's present there more often, particularly if there is an institution like additional protocol. You can visit in short notice any building at that site and you can see what they are doing. difficulty will be the finding of the clandestine site. You saw recently how difficult it was to find this Al-Kibar reactor in Syria, which was about 1 year from the actual putting the fuel in. And Syria was very well, I think, monitored country. Such kind of installation is also fairly large. But if you are building an AVLIS facility or some other laser establishment, or even a gas centrifuge plant, their footprints are not very high. And there are no real signatures which come out, like in a reactor you might have a stack, you have a fairly large cooling system somewhere, so this may give some hints. But, you know, if you have a gas centrifuge plant, you take as an example of this Iranian IR2 it's out there. So if you have 6,000 such centrifuges, you will produce high-enriched uranium for maybe 3 nuclear weapons every year. How big it will be? I think it's roughly the size of Safeways in Georgetown. Not more. And you can have everything there. And then you plant it to some industrial complex. There is no detector which will have. So you have to find it out through the infrastructure, same way as it was found in Fordo in Iran, that they saw the people communicating and buying equipment, and then they try to figure out what is the possible place where they go, and then probably through human intelligence they got lucky. So this is a tremendous challenge to the international community, particularly for those states which are parking for their first nuclear weapon or first weapons, to find it in time and to be able to do something still with that. And then weaponization itself is another thing. And sometimes the indications come from there. And if you look how we built, for example, Iran, so yes, there was a heavy water reactor. It's very difficult to find a reasonable, justified use for that. But then you still didn't have any proof at that point of time on weapons. But then you started to find that they were interested on polonium-210, which is not a nuclear material. And we found that they were trying to produce it. So it's difficult to explain to the people where you use polonium-210 today. Maybe in 1950s, 1940s there were some usage. So it's a different ballgame, and one has to look those various indicators, even though polonium is a little bit old-fashioned way to make an initiator. If you work with the neutron sources, tritium or deuterium, you will have tens of explanations, which will fit to the story that this is a peaceful use, nothing to do with the nuclear weapons. So it's a difficult, but it only comes with this kind of multi-source information analysis and looking at the infrastructure procurement, projects, publications, guides, use of materials, and acquisition of other technologies. And most of it IAEA cannot do alone.
So, Greg, you talked about how you would compensate for the pre-detonation propagation. I don't think you said anything about the utility of the device, even if it does pre-detonate. So I think the pre-detonation, the yield of the fizzle yield of Nagasaki was maybe 700 tons.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, so of course the U.S. government wants to develop a low-yield nuclear weapon less than that.
Well, I do discuss it in the book, and indeed, even with pretty high plutonium-240 content.
Maybe we should repeat the question because we have a low speaker. What was the question?
The questions raised, I was talking about weapons where you can make the pre-detonation probability the same. Ed's asking, well, what about weapons that do pre-detonate? It's not like they yield 0 or anything. In the worst case, you have something called the fissile yield, which is the worst, which for the Nagasaki weapon was 700 tons, which doesn't sound like that much, but again, the lethal area isn't scaling linearly, so you're still talking about 20–30% of the lethal area. And I was responding that indeed I discuss it in the book, and you almost always get higher than the fizzle yield. The fizzle yield's sort of the absolute lowest, and you can always get usually a few kilotons. In fact, some work that Carson Mark did, and then the work Henry commissioned way back in 2004 with Harmon Hubbard, another weapon designer, created a methodology that I then used to give pre-detonation probabilities and different yields that you would get for different neutron backgrounds. So it's worth reading.
Well, but beyond worth reading, apparently a fizzle yield could ruin your afternoon.
Well, it would.
Yeah, I mean, because, you know, it's something that's in a kiloton range.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's 1,000 times more than a ton of high explosive. Yeah.
Hi, this is a great conversation, and I'm not here to say nuclear weapons are a great thing, everybody ought to have them. I think they kind of stink and we shouldn't have them. So, given, right, the book is well, researched and written, and it's a given that what you're saying is true. My question is, what do we do with that given? I think it's pretty well known in general terms what you're saying. And it may be a bit
Well, you
stronger.
say that, but the terms of the Iran nuclear deal didn't reflect it. And certainly there were people in DOE who knew the truth, but apparently, however that agreement got put together, and I certainly don't know, there were people who thought, well, it's only weapons grade.
Reactor-Grade.
It's only weapons grade that we need to
Oh,
worry
I see.
about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
folks.
no,
And-
I don't mean to, I don't have a sort of a belligerent question. It's really a naive and important question. If it was left out, it wasn't left out because they didn't know. It was
Well, the
left
people
out.
who formulated it
Some of them
didn't seem to know.
Well, that's a shame.
Yeah.
You would think that Dr. Moniz would have known. But no, I'm serious here. I'm really dead serious about what do we do in a reality space where there's tons and tons of spent fuel, as we know, which may be easy to count, right? I mean, that could be the best non-proliferation strategy is spent fuel bundles that, have really strong IDs and you know exactly, think we know where they are. And they're certainly easier to trace once you start reprocessing and doing other nefarious stuff. And never mind enrichment. So I'm really serious about it. That's the given. What do we do?
Well, as I said, the policy implication, having it still in the spent fuel is a significant barrier against bad use. So the key thing is to keep it there. And there's still people who, as I said, for various reasons, are still promoting plutonium recycle, still, as I say, Japan's going ahead, and it's not like the U.S. has said, hey, this is a bad idea.
Well, let me ask a corollary type question. We down blended, I forget how many tons of HEU.
500.
So that half of
500.
our nuclear electricity came from Russian bombs into nuclear state. 10% of our electricity came from nuclear weapons. That stopped. There was another agreement to do similar with plutonium, to dispose of excess, I think you'd say weapons grade plutonium, right, from pits.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of stalled for lots of reasons. But is that a good idea?
Well, certainly some sort of disposal. I mean, as you know, there were two variants. One was to burn it as MOX, another was something, I forget the jargon. Can, yes.
Well, the names keep changing, but essentially one was to fiddle with it, maybe even separate it, play with it, and then irradiate it, and the other was to put it with other garbage and to store it.
But again, I'm less concerned about what goes on in the United States than I am in non-nuclear weapon states. Certainly, because those are ones that can proliferate. Now, certainly, you know, the U.S. also wants to deal with this, but I mean, you know, my focus is more on countries that could produce new nuclear weapons, as it were, or make new nuclear weapon states.
Well,
I don't disagree.
to answer your question just a little bit further, look, we had a release event 2 days ago, and this came up. Someone said, well, you know, are there any policy prescriptions out of this? You know, one comment that was made is it might be obvious to people who come to events like this and study up, but you've self-selected yourself into a strange set of people to begin with. Most don't. And it might be useful to start making distinctions between those materials and activities that are so close to being a bomb or to becoming a bomb that you do not really get a reliable timely detection or timely warning period. Now, certainly everyone would, in principle, understand that if it was a nuclear weapon that you were inspecting, you do not have timely detection or warning because, hey, you've got the thing that you're trying to prevent extant in front of you. Now, okay, so generally you're also able to get the average citizen, untutored, to understand if you take one screw out of that disables it, but you could put the screw back in 10 seconds, that won't exactly be qualified as something that gives you timely detection or warning. If you started to make a distinction between that which you can monitor or inspect versus that which you can get reliable, early enough warning or detection of a diversion going to a bomb, and you made the distinction that, well, some things can be monitored, inspected, but only other things can be actually safeguarded out of that larger group, that might be useful. And you would presumably not be so excited about sharing the peaceful benefits of unsafeguardable nuclear activities or materials. It might help. Roughly, that's what happened to peaceful nuclear explosives. They actually were not requested and not set off after people discovered that actually they're basically bombs and there's no way to monitor or prevent someone from doing a peaceful nuclear explosive in a way that would keep them from learning everything they needed to make a bomb. So now Article 5 of the NPT, which talks about sharing the possible benefits of nuclear explosives, has been eclipsed and reinterpreted to be dead letter.
I think that goes to your opening remarks that essentially what I heard is it ain't 1945 anymore.
Right.
So we know a lot more. And the world's in a different place, and it's not just that we developed the technology and owned it. I mean, it's pretty diffuse.
Well, what isn't diffuse, yeah, okay, what isn't diffuse, and we need to get to some other questions here, but what isn't diffuse, and the reason, maybe like a fanatic, there are groups like my own that say, heads up, is we're not quite there yet. The number of countries that make plutonium that is separated, or that make highly enriched uranium, or even low enriched uranium, is not that many yet. Best to be turning your headlights on when you're driving through this neighborhood. It's dark out there. You might hit something. That's why we're here today.
I appreciate it.
Okay, Mark.
So in a boosted weapon, the fusion boost is set off by the fission explosion.
Yes,
So why wouldn't the boost be affected by pre-detonation?
because it only needs something like 100 tons worth of yield to set it off. And once you set it off, then the yield tends to be driven by the neutrons produced in the fusion reaction. So every U.S. nuclear weapon now has boosted primaries. As a result, for the U.S. it's a safety issue, because basically you can set the weapon up so that you aren't trying to get 10 kilotons, you're only trying to get 100 tons. But then you buy that back with the boosting.
Basically, you race ahead by flooding the reaction with neutrons before it can blow apart. So you get ahead of the pre-detonation by having neutron fissioning generations occur
So
even
you're
quicker.
saying even at pre-detonation, there'd be enough yield to set off
Well, in
the
fact,
fusion reaction?
boosted weapons are pre-detonated.
It depends on the quality of the composition. If the lithium fluoride, you have really good.
It's not, it's deuterium and tritium. And so weapons are pre-detonated. They're flooded with neutrons as they detonate. So that's why it doesn't matter whether it's reactor grade or weapons grade.
Well, that part is only after you have your fusion boost after the fission detonation. I mean, you have a neutron generator that goes off at the same time that the high explosive goes off.
Mm-hmm. So the weapon's flooded.
But the flooding of neutrons is not until the fusion.
No, the weapon's flooded with neutrons from the initiator. I mean, not the same level of flooding, but enough to pre-detonate it.
If they get that same neutron generator, whether they're boosted or not.
Well, then you time the initiator differently if it's not boosted. And a non-boosted weapon,
There's too much of a delay and it becomes too dilute, and then the extra freedom will reduce. So it's the timing, as long as it's still.
If you have enough of a fizzle that it wouldn't set off the.
Could we do
booster.
one thing here? I think the weapons design agency should be set up for all foreign countries, and they should work for you, but in the hallway.
Well, it's sort of important because a key aspect of the book is that boosted weapons make the grade of plutonium irrelevant, so that's a fairly important question.
Well, they do.
well, they do.
So
Okay.
that was my question.
Okay.
How?
What's in the book?
Wait.
Boosted weapons.
Well,
Read the book.
More than the presence.
a more modern
Very
a more modern design of weapons called boosted, and in that sort of weapon, you make them hollow, and right before you set it off, you put a gas mixture of deuterium and tritium in it, and as you detonate the weapon, see, in an ordinary fission weapon, you detonate the weapon and it gets compressed, and you're trying to wait till it gets to the optimum compressed, and then you release neutrons and it goes boom. But in a boosted weapon, I release the neutrons as soon as I detonate the weapon. So just as the weapon goes critical, it's already blowing up. And so
As soon as the fission reaction takes place to set off the boosting.
By the way,
Oh,
this is
no, as soon as the weapon becomes critical. The weapon's subcritical when it's sitting there. I detonate it, the weapon becomes critical. I've already released neutrons into it, so fission chain reaction, boom. You have a nuclear explosion. The yield's only 100 tons, but 100 tons is enough to set off the DT reaction in the center of the thing. That produces not much yield, but it produces a large number of neutrons. Those large number of neutrons cause a large number of fissions, and I go back from 100 tons to 10 kilotons.
But the pre-detonation that prevented the 100-ton.
No, it was pre-detonated. It was
I think
pre-detonated.
you have a linguistic bridge you got to make between the word pre-detonation and fizzle failure. Okay, you can pre-detonate and still get to the 10 kiloton yard line.
If the yield that you expected from weapons grade is lower because it's reactor grade, then it might not be enough to trigger.
Yeah, so is that right?
No. The yield's always going to, I can always get 100 tons. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, the fizzle yield of even Nagasaki, which was a pretty primitive weapon with 700 tons. So I can get 100 tons.
They were unboosted. The key thing here is boosting and having a fusion reaction take place.
Well, but before the fusion reaction takes place, I have a nuclear detonation, and I get a 100-ton yield. And that 100-ton yield then sets off the fusion reaction, which releases a lot of neutrons and boosts the yield back up to 10 KT.
Let's
Okay.
off-ramp this, please.
All
Because
right.
all you need to know is boosting, schmoosting or not, without it, you can get the 10 to 12 kiloton design on top of that Iranian missile. So this is icing on the argumentative cake.
Okay.
All right?
So we had,
Yes, let's,
So, two things. When you were talking about how high it was,
how high what was?
the plutonium, the reactor-grade, I think that you meant when before it was separated because of the actinides?
No, because of the isotopes of plutonium.
Okay.
See, I start out getting plutonium-239, but as it sits there in the reactor, some of it fissions, but some of it becomes plutonium-240, and then plutonium-241, and then plutonium-242. And so then the plutonium's a mixture of that. And also, if I'm using enriched uranium, I get plutonium-238. I mean, again, this is discussed in Chapter 3, I think. And because of this mixture, then the plutonium has different properties, because the different isotopes have different properties.
I thought you were talking about the actinides. But a related question, is kind of, and I know you don't go into this in the book, about the use of lasers, or do you go into that?
No, I don't say a word about lasers.
That's
Because fortunately, that's not an issue. I mean, people were kicking that around, especially in the 90s in the US, that they were going to try to isotopically separate plutonium isotopes. But nobody's done that, and as far as I know, no one's anywhere close to doing that. That's one of the things we don't have to worry about at
how
the
should I
moment.
put it? The good news is, the news is bad enough. You don't need that. You're in trouble already. Okay.
Okay, so back to the fact that we have all this reactor-grade plutonium laying around. And maybe we can, maybe we cannot detect nefarious uses, whatever. So what options do we have? Do we have a volunteer or an IAEA-based, like, human intelligence force that, like, will volunteer to monitor in the facilities they work? Or do we, secondly, to prevent these non-nuclear countries, everybody wants a reactor, everybody wants nuclear power, they want to play with the big boys, do we reinvigorate the U.S. nuclear industry so that we're the ones providing these reactors and the fuel and taking it back? Because as the former head of the American Nuclear Society said when we briefed DOD many years ago, if we don't play, we have no say.
Yeah.
So if
By the
we're
way,
not involved in
that
this,
rhymes.
and we're not there,
Yeah,
how
okay.
do we monitor?
Okay. I think we got the question. Why don't we let these two people answer?
Well, the U.S. has a lot of influence whether we play or not. I mean, we didn't provide reactors to North Korea. Well, among other problems, there is no more U.S. nuclear industry. Well, and I grew up in Pittsburgh, and to think what Westinghouse is now is sort of a strange thing. But nevertheless, it's not clear what nuclear future there is. I'm far more concerned about keeping the plutonium in the spent fuel of the countries that got the reactors already, rather than trying to provide even more reactors to more countries.
But that's going to happen no matter what.
Well, wait a minute. You make it.
Whether we do anything.
Yeah, okay, let's stop. Wait a minute, wait. You make it sound like this is like a television. It's on or it's off, or it's like a pregnancy. You're either pregnant or you're not. It matters a lot whether it's a lot of reactors in places like the Middle East or not. It matters when. It matters what the conditions are on that fuel. And I think the idea that, oh, well, what we'll do is, do with nuclear energy what we did with John Glenn. We'll shoot them back up in space a second time, and we'll recreate this industry. that cannot be the only option, because that does suggest, you know, demoralization is the only course. You know, we were told recently, right up here, not in a room much below one floor here, that we didn't have any choice. We had to be in the trade to control it. In the case of Saudi Arabia and, dare I say it, South Korea, that unless we were in the trade and dominant and being the only supplier, we couldn't encourage South Korea or Saudi Arabia to think about what the terms might be for doing nuclear energy activities. Now, there was somebody in the room, thankfully, and had election certificates, that said, you've got to be kidding. We're selling these people hundreds of billions of dollars of arms. In one case, we have 28,000 troops. Are you telling me that America isn't even that great that it can't talk about this with them?
Well, we should be.
Well, I think the short answer, of course, was thank God for the guy who got election certificates. He had common sense. The answer is yes. Not only that, but you know, one of the other interesting things which was raised by someone at another gathering recently. Do you know how many countries enrich uranium that sell it commercially? Not many. Do you know who are the most dominant? Well, they're Europeans.
The French.
Well, actually, Urenco.
Russians.
Say again?
Russians.
Well, Russia, you can't win them all. Yeah, but you know what? You start with your friends. Have we talked about this to them? Do they put conditions? Guess what? The answer is no. So you start thinking about the problem and you start building solutions. You do not start for the thickest part of the fence and figure out what is the hardest way to have influence.
Well, again, that's something we need to be doing.
Well, we
We
do,
have to get involved
but
in
I
something.
always say problem first, solution second. Not, oh, we don't have any solutions, let's not think about the problem.
I think people say now JCPOA is a solution where you legitimize enrichment and eventually reprocessing at one day, which goes against decade-long US non-proliferation policies. And this is now the argument for the countries in Middle East and elsewhere. Why should we forego when Iran didn't forego?
Well, this gets to another point. You know, there may be some effort to get, quote unquote, a new deal. Now, who knows how well that will go? I see smiling all around this table. But how you argue about what you want and what you argue about you want may have some impact on how you do things even with countries that aren't Iran. I'll give you an example. We talked about this last time. Most people don't know it, but the sensors and cameras that the IA has, not all of them actually send a signal in real time or near real time every few minutes back to some remote location like Vienna. Some of them, you got to go every 90 days. Well, within 90 days, you can do an awful lot of mischief, like turn off the lights so you can't see, pull out a rod, put a dummy in. You might not know. You might want to do real-time surveillance. Now, we asked for that surveillance for Natanz. It's an enrichment plant. The IAEA, we just learned from the last session from Olli, asked Iran for it for Bushehr, and they said, well, no, we don't think so. We don't feel good about that. Well, you might want to double down on that point for any new deal. But you first have to have a problem that would spotlight the desirability of having that kind of solution. That's why the book is interesting.
Let's,
Yeah, so would it be, how useful of a solution would it be for countries to establish permanent repositories in order to combat like growing stockpiles of spent fuel and plutonium? Would it be, is that the simplest solution for individual countries to find their own, or have international depositories so that these stockpiles are just, like, recycling in general is a great practice, but this time from hearing from you that recycling plutonium may not be such a great practice, and it would be better just to get rid of it with would that be one of the simplest? I mean, is that the easiest solution?
It might be, but given the difficulties of creating repositories, what's de facto happening, and this would be okay, at least in the short run, is simply long-term storage at the reactors, as long as the fuel isn't reprocessed. I mean, that's basically what's going on in the U.S. And now, now what that'll do for future reactor siting, when people realize that not only are you siting a reactor there, but a long-term nuclear waste site, when you site the reactor is something else. But on the other hand, they aren't siting many reactors in the U.S. today. So,
to what extent do the findings that you present in your book bolster the argument of President Trump that we might as well tear up the Iran deal and start over?
well, that's a separate issue, and on my website I've written about the Iran deal. I wasn't a big fan of it. I'm of two minds. I mean, certainly the Iran deal could be better, and given what President Trump's done, hopefully he can make it better. Because clearly,
be clear, so deficient by overlooking reactor-grade plutonium.
Well, there were a number of concessions in the Iran deal that I wasn't a big fan of, including the sunset. In fact, Henry and I were among the first people to point out that the deal as set up in December 2013, we said, hey, this is only going to be limited. Now, people didn't focus on that right away because they kept thinking, well, it'll be 30 or 40 or 50 years, it'll be okay. And it was only when the actual terms came out, people realized it. But I would think the U.S., and not just on Iran, though this would strengthen our case with Iran, as a part of a general policy, as I've said, would be no separated plutonium in any non-nuclear weapon state. That way Iran couldn't say, well, hey, you're picking on us. This would apply to any such country. And and the same with enrichment. Basically the gold standard. And and we could certainly try, given that President Trump wants a new deal, for me, that would be the basis for arranging it. The gold standard, no sunset.
But it seems like you're almost arguing against going ahead with it as it is, because it's somewhat irrelevant.
Well, the U.S.
I think
isn't
that
going
ship
ahead
has
with
sailed, sir. Okay, so what you're arguing about, you like re-arguing things. The decision's been made. Yeah.
Can you talk about the difference between CANDU reactors and light water reactors and the spent fuel? Since my understanding is that if you're having using uranium fuel that's non-enriched, it causes some better opportunity for plutonium production that's more amenable to making nuclear weapons.
Well, the U.S. nuclear industry tends to argue that, and certainly I can use CANDU reactors. In the book, again, chapter 3 discusses the plutonium characteristics of CANDU versus light water reactors. Certainly in normal operation, the CANDU plutonium is somewhat more readily used for weapons, and with its online refueling, I could probably get somewhat better material. But this tends to overlook the light water reactors. When they first go into operation, churn out significant amounts of low burn-up plutonium that's relatively good. So when I did this thing on South Korea yesterday for Henry, there's already something like 2 metric tons of rather low burn-up plutonium from light water reactors, because they've already started up 21 light water reactors in South Korea, and each one produces some. So you're looking at so it really doesn't matter.
How do you define low burnup? What period of time?
Basically 1 year.
Oh. That's a long time. I mean, you refueled after a year and a half.
Well, the Iranians refueled after 1 year,
Well,
and they
10
put
months in the first instance.
It's the first reload you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
The first
Steady
discharge.
state.
The first discharge is, and the plutonium that comes out of that is pretty good looking. In fact, I've written a paper, I reference it in the book, it's on my website, because the Iranians published what the plutonium isotopics were of that fuel from their first discharge at Bushehr. And it was pretty good.
It's called sporty. If you're really interested, and you
Just
have,
hire a physicist,
no,
so I'm happy.
well, no, you don't have to hire a physicist.
We did.
you? No, but did you graduate from high school? You took chemistry, didn't you?
Yeah.
You can do this. Like Obama said, yes, you can. Okay.
Make a nuclear weapon?
Roughly. You can understand it a bit better. There, on our website, there is a primer on fission, fusion, and bomb design. And there's another one on reactors. Now, I'm told we tried to get people who were expert on weapons design to review it, and they pushed it back and said, don't ever ask me to review this.
That sounds good.
Take a
Should I
look.
use it in my class?
And, well, there you go. Now, it's not perfect. It was written by students using the web. So you can, I'm sure you can get through this, and there are lots of pictures. One of my complaints with this presentation of yours is not enough pictures. We need more pictures.
There is one aspect to the condos which you need also to look, and this is the size of the fuel bundle. It's about this.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you create a reprocessing scheme, it would be by far more easier to deal with those bundles than with this 4-meter long irradiated LWR. So there are
Yeah.
some other aspects
Well,
here.
there
which-
are advantages
yeah.
to you. It's also fueled constantly, which means you can adjust how much exposure there is to that neutron process, which means you can actually dictate how much weapons grade versus reactor grade you get out of that fuel by pushing it out a little bit earlier. And it's also harder to inspect because there's all this activity all the time, whereas with the light water reactor, you've got to unbolt it.
Well, but they did. I mean,
Yes.
it's the thing, it wasn't a violation of IAEA safeguards when Iran shut down the reactor and took all the fuel out of it in 2012.
Yes.
And actually it was taken out by the Russians and not Iranians. Let's speak accurate here.
Well-
The reactor is still run by the Russians.
By the way, the Americans felt so confident and at ease with the point that you just drew out that we flew approximately 12 to 13 drones over Bushehr, make damn sure nothing left the building. You know,
And-
so it's not good enough after the fact to know that, oh, well, you know, this was the case or that the case. What you want to do with this kind of nuclear uncertainty is reduce the uncertainty budget as much as you can and not rely on, how shall I put it?
Handshakes.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna have to,
We
I have
have
an
to
appointment
close.
at Dulles this
Yes.
afternoon,
And
so.
we're done.
Okay.